Welcome to the Wednesday webinar. I'll just give it one more second and we'll get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's National Bleeding Disorders Foundation Wednesday webinar. My name is Fiona Robinson, and I am the series host. The title of today's webinar is coreVWD and the Future of VWD Clinical Trials, Centering the Patient Voice. This webinar is being recorded. The recording will be available shortly after it ends on the NBDF website, bleeding.org. We encourage you to ask any questions you may have today. You can ask your question by using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen at any time during the webinar. We will monitor these questions, and following our speakers' presentations, we will put your questions to them. Today, we are joined by Dr. Paula James, Professor of Medicine at Queen's University in Kingston, Canada, Baiba Ziamele, lived experience expert with von Willebrand disease and an advocate for people with inheritable bleeding disorders in Latvia, Europe, and globally, Nicole Scape-Hagen, lived experience expert with von Willebrand disease and a manager of education at NBDF, Mark Skinner, who leads the Patient Outcomes Research Group, and Elizabeth Clearfield, who is a senior research manager with the Patient Outcomes Research Group. I'd like to thank Dr. James, Baiba, Nicole, Mark, and Elizabeth for joining us today, and I'll pass things over now to Elizabeth to get things started.
Thank you, Fiona. I briefly want to recognize that coreVWD, the project we're talking about today, was sponsored as a non-competitive collaboration by the companies on the screen, and we appreciate and thank them for their help in allowing us to do this important work. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what is coreVWD and what methods were used. So the first thing I want to do is tell you a little bit about what a core outcome set is. Here on the screen, you see something that looks like it can come from the Consumer Reports magazine or now on the website, where you're comparing two mixers. So you have, where a bread maker or mixer to make some dough, and you can see that they have in the middle on the gray a list of things, and they get a rating on how well they do making bread, cookie dough, cake batter, small batches or large batches, and you can see they are getting a number of stars. A core outcome set is similar to what you see here. A core outcome set is for clinical trials where you come up with a list of things that should be measured. Imagine if you were trying to compare these two mixers and you didn't have any information about cookie dough for the one on the left, and then you only had information about small batches and large batches for the one on the right. It would be a lot harder to compare if you were missing some of these items. And the same follows for a clinical trial. If you have a clinical trial for a new treatment and you want to compare it to a treatment that's already available or perhaps another new treatment, it would be difficult for you to compare if you were missing some of these things. So then we come to what is a core outcome set? Similar to what I just said, it's an agreed standardized set of outcomes that should be measured and reported as a minimum, meaning you can collect other things, but as a minimum, they should be reported in all clinical research in a specific area of healthcare. Now, this definition is from the COMET website. COMET is a group in the UK, and that stands for the Core Outcomes Measures in Effectiveness Trials, and they set the standards for core outcome sets. And here's an example of what their page is. So you will see the coreVWD one coming up on their page soon, but they have a lot of information. They've made a lot of publications about how to do the methods of developing a core outcome set, and we followed those methods for this work. You might ask, why do we need core outcomes? on the left, you can see when clinical trials don't measure the same thing, it's difficult to compare the treatment outcomes because you have different things. So in one trial, you're measuring a red check mark, and another, you're measuring a purple star, and in another, you're measuring a blue check mark, but you can't compare them. When you have a core outcome set, people can make more informed decisions about treatment options because everybody is measuring that red check and that red oval, and they may be measuring other things as well, but you're able to make the comparison between the outcomes that are the same. So we have the question of what should be measured in von Willebrand disease. Should it be bleeding frequency? How do we categorize that? Is that an annual bleeding rate or, a number of times per month? How do we really measure that? Are we looking at joint bleed rates, heavy menstrual bleeding, severity of bleeding? What is important to measure? That was the question. And then what should be reported? So if you look at this table, you may see that this could represent four different treatments on the left, but they may have only reported the annualized bleeding rate. Another one maybe only reported annualized joint bleeding rate. In yet another trial, maybe they were focusing on heavy menstrual bleeding. But as you see here, you can't compare. Now think back to the mixer. The mixer comparison, what we're really looking for is this, where each trial or each treatment has this information about the outcomes that are most important. So we had our project goal, which was to develop a core outcome set. And that set would be recommended to be included in all the pivotal clinical trials and post-approval studies for drug therapies, both factor and non-factor for von Willebrand disease. And the outcomes that we were included, we wanted them to demonstrate the value of the therapies. And we always kept in mind that access is the goal. When you measure the right things in clinical trials, that helps bring the right therapies to the right people. And core outcome sets are also very useful across the life cycle of a product. So all the way when a product is being developed by the pharmaceutical company, in the scientific research that they're doing to develop a new molecule or a new treatment, all the way through on market use. So if you have a core outcome set, it's great for getting it on the market. The FDA can approve it or the EMA may approve it. Having core outcomes that allows the FDA and those other regulatory bodies to know what outcome to expect. They know what data they're going to get so they can assess whether the treatment should be approved. Once the treatment's approved, you have market access, that's here in the middle. Groups do health technology assessments, and having that increased predictability allows them to decide, who should get access to the treatment, who will we pay for to be able to get access to those treatments. And having those core outcomes is important there. And then finally, on market, when these treatments are in use, these core outcomes are important for patient and clinician decision making. That way, if a patient comes to their doctor and they say, the most important thing to me about a treatment is X, if that's one of the core outcome sets, then they can say, well, that data has been collected and we can tell you, when you're comparing the treatments, this one is the best one for you. So we developed a core outcome set using a process called a Delphi process, which is a structured consensus exercise. So we started by doing a literature review and talking with key people in the von Willebrand disease space to develop a list of potential outcomes. And that was a very long list. I think it was something like 96 outcomes. And then we did 3 rounds of a Delphi. So a Delphi is an online voting process where our voters rated all of the outcomes on a scale from 1 to 9. And then we had preset consensus criteria where an outcome would either stay on the list or it would be removed from the list. And so we slowly got down to a reduced list of outcomes until we got to our final core outcome set. In the middle of Delphi round 1 and Delphi round 2, we also had an in-person consensus meeting. That's where we got our group of voters together and they discussed the outcomes that were still on the list. And each different group, each different member had the opportunity to advocate for certain outcomes and tell the rest of the voters why they were important to them, why they gave a certain outcome a higher rating than others, why they really felt that a certain outcome should be or should not be in a core outcome set. Our work was multi-stakeholder by design, so we included 4 different groups of people. We had people living with von Willebrand disease, a mix of people with type 1, 2, and 3. We also had members of the von Willebrand disease guidelines committees. We also included clinicians, hematology, adult and pediatric hematologists, as well as representatives from the dental field, OBGYN, physical therapy, and social work. For our project, those pharmaceutical companies that sponsored this work were also invited to have 2 voters so 2 per sponsor. And we suggested to them that it should be 1 person from the clinical development team and another from the market access team. And then finally, we had representatives from regulatory bodies, payers, drug pan, and also some observers from the FDA. So here's the breakdown of our group. And as you can see, we really did want to focus on patients here. And we did include 35% of our voting group, which was a total of 39 voters, were patients or patient advocates. You can see that that's the top here. So I mentioned to you that we asked our voters in each Delphi round to rate the outcomes. So this is how we had them think about the outcomes. So when you're thinking about an outcome, you want to know what is the most important, because of course everything is important. Any information you can get about a new treatment is going to be important, but we really want to get down to what are those core things that we want to say these should always be measured, always be reported, and we know that we can expect them. So as I mentioned, we had rating on a scale from 1 to 9, where 1 to 3 was you're saying the outcome is not really that important. We recognize it's important, but we can live without it. 4 to 6 was it's important, but it's not critical. And then that 7 to 9 is the critical vote. So if this was an outcome that one of our voters wanted for the core outcome set, they should give it a rating between 7 and 9. And as I mentioned, we had preset consensus criteria. So there was either high consensus, patient important consensus, or we would eliminate it. So an outcome would stay on the list if it reached high consensus. So if more than 70% of our voters gave it that 7, 8, or 9 critical, otherwise it would be eliminated unless the patient group, and as I just told you, that was 35% of our voters. If the patient group gave something a high outcome, it was saved so it could stay on the list. So we really wanted to give the patient voice an extra boost there. And that's why we included that in our consensus criteria. So here's an example of a high consensus outcome. This was severity of bleeds. And as you can see, each little dot represents one of our voters, and everybody gave it a 7, 8, or a 9. So that stayed on the list. Here's an example of a patient important outcome. So this was an outcome, ability to receive epidural anesthesia. So this was an outcome that you can see, and I've put a red circle around it. Most of our patients gave it a very high rating, and that's 7, 8, or 9. But you can see the other groups were kind of spread across the board here. So this was an outcome that our patient group saved. So that was very interesting to us to be able to keep that on the list due to our patient voters. So these are our results. We did develop 2 core outcome sets, one for prophylaxis treatment and one for perioperative treatment. And there are some that overlap, so they were included on both lists. We also called out a specific group of outcomes that were important to women and girls and people with the potential to menstruate. And we recommend these outcomes will be included in trials where appropriate. So if there are people, if it's a trial specifically for women and girls, people with the potential to menstruate, or you're looking at some of these some treatments that treat menstrual blood loss or heavy menstrual bleeding, these are the outcomes that should be included. Those are in that cream colored circle. And Paula can tell you a little bit more about them. And finally, I want to finish with the fact that, we really did try to have the patient voice as the star throughout. We had patients talk about their life in our in-person meeting, talk about why outcomes were important to them. We had that special criteria. We included a lot of patients. And as you can see here, we did have some important outcomes that made it onto the list because of the patients. So you can see menstrual period duration is something that made it into that WGPPM outcome group. And you can see here the average vote for the patients was 8.43. So, almost up there at that highest 9 category, where the non-patients gave it a lower vote, almost a whole point lower there. And then same thing with quality of life. You can see that was very important to patients. So it was above 7. And again, 7 was that cutoff. And again, the patients, they weren't saying it wasn't, the non-patients, they weren't saying it wasn't important. They weren't giving it like a 1 or a 2, but the average vote was, under that 7. So you can really see here that the patients drove our final results. So now with that summary, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Paula James, and you can just let me know when you want me to advance the slides.
Great. Thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks for Fiona and NBDF for hosting this today. This slide shows you what Elizabeth already set up for us, which is how we reduced the lists of outcomes from where we started at the top to those that made it into the final publication at the bottom, including the Delphi rounds of voting that happened. And then in the colored circles, you can kind of see which were for prophylaxis, which were for women and girls, people with the potential to menstruate, and which were for perioperative treatment. And so if you go ahead. So on this slide, we have in a table the final list of outcomes. And so for anyone who's familiar with von Willebrand disease, the fact that this is a complicated list will make sense to you. What we heard from our patients as we were going through this process is that for some, it's one type of bleeding that is the biggest problem. But for many, on one day, it could be a nosebleed and heavy periods and extensive bruising that is having an impact on their daily life. And that heterogeneity is really important, and I think is reflected in our results here. So you can see for prophylactic treatment, it's the frequency of bleed, it's the kind of bleed. Is it musculoskeletal? Is it mucocutaneous? What do you have to do to control the bleed? Quality of life. And then those that are bolded turned up in multiple of the sets. So severity, duration, and bleeds requiring treatment. You can see for the women's health, menstrual blood loss, how long a period lasts, heavy menstrual bleeding that requires treatment, need for blood transfusion, postpartum hemorrhage, and need for blood transfusion around delivery. So this core outcome set resonates to me as a clinician who takes care of these patients. And we're going to hear from Baiba and Nicole, importantly, I think, how this resonates with them as people with lived experience. And on the next slide, we have all of that information organized in this Venn diagram that shows how these outcomes are organized depending on indication and then where there's some overlap. And this is important at this point in time because we're really on the edge of a lot of innovation in the von Willebrand disease space. And I'm really delighted about the fact that we have existing and novel therapies that are being looked at in clinical trials for von Willebrand disease. And so the timing of this is really important. This isn't an extensive list of novel therapies, but gives you an idea of things that are coming. And I think what we've been able to do with this core outcome set is inform the companies that are, and the investigators that are looking at these treatments. What is it that the VWD community wants to see in terms of what they evaluate in their clinical trials? And what are we going to need to make decisions about what gets funded? And for clinicians and patients, which of these potential novel therapies is going to be best for that particular patient and their life. And so the impact of what we've done here, Elizabeth has highlighted this, and it's so important to be aware of how multi-stakeholder this was. You can imagine that getting all of those people in the same room at the same time was quite a challenge, but there was really a commitment to doing this. And so that as a group, we could provide clear expectations for clinical trials and give guidance on the outcomes that the VWD community think are important. What does it mean for patients? I think it will improve the quality and the applicability of the clinical trials. As Elizabeth outlined so nicely with her figures, it's going to allow you to make comparisons across treatment options and decide what's going to be best for you and make an informed choice about which treatments you want to try and what you think is going to work best. In terms of the patient organization and their involvement, one of the really key messages that was heard repeatedly and strongly and had a big influence on us was the fact that heavy menstrual bleeding was previously not even considered a bleed in trials that were designed for men with inherited bleeding disorders. And so for hemophilia trials, for example, and that just will not work for the VWD population. And so That's why that category for women and girls and people with the potential to menstruate was really highlighted and separated out. And the message is that that has to be measured in VWD clinical trials. It's not easy. It actually takes a fair bit of thought for how to do this and how to do this well. But I think the message from the coreVWD group is crystal clear. This has to be done. And it has to be done well and in a way that patients can interpret. In terms of additional ways that the patient organizations can be involved, so certainly advocating and having that voice for heavy menstrual bleeding, but also being aware of coreVWD, participating in coreVWD, making it known to their members. I think this is a really concrete activity explicitly in support of the VWD community. And so we've had wonderful partnerships along the way as we've been working on this project. These partner organizations provided us introductions to patients who became our voters. There was a great deal of useful input throughout the process. And then as is happening today, our partner organizations are helping us disseminate and make known this core outcome set. So we want to acknowledge the World Federation of Hemophilia, the National Bleeding Disorder Foundation, the European Hemophilia Consortium, and the Canadian Hemophilia Society, all of whom worked carefully and thoughtfully with us throughout this project. In terms of what can happen going forward and how can patient organizations continue to be involved, understand the work that was done, share it with members, advocate for its use in clinical trials. I think increasingly the companies who are involved are engaging appropriately with patients and patient organizations. And if you're in that position, make sure that they know about coreVWD and advocate that those outcomes are included. Publicizing it to other stakeholders, patients, healthcare providers, policymakers, and payers. This outcome set can be used, I think, to guide emerging efforts within the VWD community that are being led by patient organizations, because we've given clear guidance on what's important to the community. And that can be used to inform many different kinds of conversations with all of our partners, including with industry. And so you're going to hear a little bit more about this from Mark and Elizabeth, but since we've published this work, our attention has started to turn to how do you do this? How do we measure these outcomes, and how can we make sure that patients and clinicians have the information that they need to decide what the best treatments are? And so to conclude, I hope I've convinced you about a number of aspects of the work that we've done. And I think everybody on the call today should feel some sense of responsibility and feel empowered to advocate for clinical trials that serve VWD patients and improve their lives going forward. So thank you for your attention. With that, I'm going to turn it over to the wonderful Baiba, who's going to talk about her experience with this project.
So thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to share my experience as a patient in this very important project. Let me briefly take you over the milestones of my own patient journey. So I was born in 1982, always struggling with bruises and bleeds, but nobody ever thought that we, 3 children in our family, might have inherited a bleeding disorder from my dad and his mother. It was in 1990s, after an accident with my sister, we all 3 were diagnosed with von Willebrand disease. Life went on and we were instructed to be careful, avoid sports and other activities where we could get injuries. We saw hematologists every 3 months but had no proper treatment. Parents motivated us to study and become good persons in general and never showed how stressed they were about our future. Only later, when I started attending international conferences about bleeding disorders, I realized how much more information there is beyond. It's something like hemophilia, but it's not hemophilia. And I tried to get all these possibilities to my country, Latvia. It's in Eastern Europe, if you don't know. But believe me, patients everywhere, even in better developed countries, still struggle. Several attempts to diagnose my type failed, and then I got a chance to do a genetic test. Fast forward, I was 39 years old when I found out my type and could start my way to the treatment. I was denied individual reimbursement, but last autumn, 1 milligram factor was finally included in the reimbursement system. I got it just a few months ago, and now I face new challenges to find somebody who can help me with injections while I'm still learning. I mostly have small, spontaneous, or trauma-related bleeds, heavy periods, and very annoying bruises, as here in those pictures. And not because of my disease is mild, because it's not, but because I have always been super cautious not to hurt myself or otherwise happen to be in the need for medical attention. I often could not have the same medical procedures other people had, such as dental work or massage and anything else, because doctors were always scared of my blood. This is the same reason I don't have children. I was always terrified that it would be too much stress and burden for our health system and my family. But going back to the core of von Willebrand disease project, I absolutely loved being part of the team. I do believe that patient voices matter, and I saw it happening on the ground in the very best possible way. First, the scientific team had collected various stakeholders to follow their strict methodology, and we all received clear instructions of what is expected and how we can contribute. It seemed very easy while waiting the outcomes during the Delphi process from home and giving Elizabeth and her team a lot of headache how to cut less important outcomes, because for us patients, everything seemed very important. I want to highlight the face-to-face meeting in which we were divided in teams with various stakeholders at one table. We had to come up with most important outcomes to leave in the final outcome set. I again saw how different are our experiences and ideas. For doctors who have accumulated the knowledge of treating many patients, for us patients, the lived experience, and for everyone else, there were different focuses. And I'm glad we have agreement to document and measure various symptoms. My experiences as a patient are different than those for other family members and patients in other countries, but they are all very important in this conversation. We had a long discussion about the symptoms and stuff, but eventually agreed with other teams on the most important indicators and that women-related outcomes should also be monitored during the research of new medicines. Sometimes what is important for doctors is not the same what is important for patients. For example, I dream about a treatment I can use myself without going to the hospital with everything what doctors don't consider a medical problem, but what restricts my life. And my wish is that our collective effort brings benefits to the patients in the future. On top, this process confirmed patients are experts too, with just different set of knowledge. And when working together, the process and outcomes can be richer and more beneficial for everyone. So thank you again. And let's hear the story of Nicole.
Thank you so much, Baiva, and just really amazing job. I really appreciate your perspective and congratulations on getting access to Factor. Sending you well wishes that those infusions will get easier with time and practice, but I know you're a very amazing person and they will. Hello, everyone out there. My name is Nicole Scappi-Hagen, and I am from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. You'll see maybe a little photo down there in the bottom corner. I'm a big visual person, so lots of photos for me. I have been an advocate for over 15 years in this community, nationally and internationally, and I've worked full-time with the National Bleeding Disorders Foundation for the past 7 years, currently serving as manager of education. And I'd like to just acknowledge that today I'm here in the capacity of a lived experience expert and not NBDF staff. So a little bit about me. I have von Willebrand disease, and I'm not the only one in my family. On like the bottom left of the slide, you'll see this big group of them all smiling, and those folks are my family. 4 of my siblings in there have von Willebrand disease. My mom and my late grandfather had VWD. The other folks that are in the picture are just people I love very much. My dad, my stepmom, nieces and nephews, Grandma Judy. And my nieces and nephews, we don't not know currently if they have VWD or not. They've had some testing and have tested negative, but they have some symptoms. So you kind of know, if you know about VWD, some of the issues and struggles with testing. In the bottom right corner, that is my puppy. His name is Fontanella. He is much, much larger than this photo now. And just a heads up, he may or may not make a guest appearance. It all just depends on his mood. Hopefully not. Hopefully he keeps sleeping. And then I got married 2 years ago. I feel like that's not really new, but I always like to shout it out. And my incredible husband. You can see a few photos of him here, but any opportunity I have to pull these photos out, I try to. But then what you will see in some of these images are bleeds that I've had over the past 2 years, I would say. And the top one is actually from 6 weeks after I had wrist surgery last year. And then the photo in like the middle-ish bottom right is from a volleyball game. And then the one on the left of my knee, that happened actually after I bumped my knee off of my friend's boat. There's like a piece of metal that was sticking out of the boat. Like you hook the lines or stuff on it, but I bumped my knee off of that and it turned into like a crazy giant knee bleed. But a little bit, again, for me, much of my life, I did not receive any treatment for Wolverine disease. I spent a lot of time in the emergency room for joint bleeds that were often misdiagnosed as growth plate fractures. And as a result of that, I was frequently treated with casts, which, as many of you know, is far from ideal for managing a joint bleed. I was not, again, diagnosed until I was a teenager, but once I had a diagnosis, I learned due to my type of VWD, I had to try a specific medication as a trial run, which did not work for me. And then when that medication didn't work, I was told that because of my type, I was not eligible for factor replacement therapy, which is not accurate. But it took strong advocacy, persistence, and a lot of documentation for me to finally access the treatment that I needed. And again, I just wanted to kind of inform you all kind of a little bit who I am, give you a little glimpse into who Nicole is, because I'm not going to go like and do a deep dive of my story, but I will say that access to care and treatment has truly changed my life. It has allowed me to manage bleeding episodes, and more importantly, it saved my life during a procedure that went unexpectedly wrong. It's also played a crucial role in preventing more bleeding and preventing it in past surgeries that I've had. And today I'm happy to share I do not live in the emergency room anymore at all, and I'm able to follow a regular treatment regimen that has made all the difference. And I really believe that my own experiences have pushed me to stand up and be a voice for those who haven't found theirs yet. And over the years, I've had some mentors, some are on this call, who did that for me and who showed me the power of advocacy and encouraged me to speak up. And eventually I knew it was my turn to step up and give back. And a few years ago, I had the honor of serving on the VWD Guidelines Diagnostic Panel. And that experience was not only personally meaningful, but it also helped prepare me for my role as a voter in coreVWD. And it deepened my understanding and strengthened my commitment to ensuring others have access to care and the support they need. And so with coreVWD, being a voter to the project was very meaningful, very empowering experience for me. As a patient, it is not very often that I get asked what I think should matter in clinical trials. And this project gave me that chance, and it took my input seriously. From the very beginning, you know, Elizabeth and her team, they made sure that we understood the process. I'm a big question gal, and if I don't understand something, I will just keep asking in different ways until I get it, because what I didn't want to do is vote for something I wasn't sure of or understand a process. And so the training that they gave us and that background information definitely made me feel very confident when it came time to rate those outcomes. And I really appreciated that rule that allowed outcomes for rated highly for patients to stay in the running, even if others didn't agree. And what I think that showed me is that, you know, this wasn't just a checkbox for patient involvement, right? Like, this is real inclusion. They really care what we want and have to say. And I think, you know, what stood out to me the most, I think, is how much the outcomes, they focused on real life issues that people with VWD face every day, especially those who menstruate and deal with pregnancy. It meant a lot to see these experiences discussed openly and taken seriously. I do remember my table in a story a woman shared with me, I'll never forget. And she talked about like just being in the ER and laying in there with her legs up, and she had a heavy menstrual cycle and just crying and no one being able to help her. And so seeing her be at the table and being empowered as well to add to this conversation is exactly who we needed at the table. And, kind of just to wrap things up, I would say that, this was important to me because it helped shift the focus of research toward the actual lives of people with VWD. And the treatments being developed should reflect our priorities and not just clinical numbers. And so knowing that my voice helps shape what gets measured in future studies and hopefully improves care for those with VWD down the line is something that I'm really proud of and grateful to be part of. And so thank you for letting me give you a little glimpse into my world, my experience with this. And with that, I'll go ahead and I'll pass it to Mark.
So good day, everyone. Wow, what amazing speakers, and thank you for generously sharing your story. I live with hemophilia, but I've been passionate about making sure that the entire global bleeding disorders family is represented and that we have equal opportunity. So having the opportunity to work with Paula and the coreVWD Delphi group really is important as we try to advance our global goals. Some of you will be familiar with the PROBE study, which was developed now about 10 years ago, focused on hemophilia, developed by those living with hemophilia for hemophilia. And this platform has been used around the world, but it doesn't cover von Willebrand disease. And in many respects, it doesn't fully capture the lived experience of women with a bleeding disorder. So to not only allow the coreVWD set to support clinical research in the next generation of therapies, we think it's important that it can also support the lived experience for advocacy, as Elizabeth nicely mentioned early on. So we have been working to expand the PROBE study to include von Willebrand disease holistically, and as well as build out the women's component. I'm pleased to say that we have recently reconstituted the PROBE investigator group to now include 3 individuals with VWD to help guide our work going forward, and Baiba is one of those. So thank you to Baiba. So we launched on International Women's Day a women's module, which now incorporates many of the elements for VWD, but we still have more work to do. So we have been in a process of mapping the kinds of outcomes that are collected. Many of the outcomes on this core outcomes list are indeed patient reported. While they might be clinically recorded, the patients are the ones that actually record them. And so we want to make sure that we are able to actually capture the patient voice and be able to quantify them in a way. So I'm going to, one other thing before I shift back to Elizabeth is I do want to make a note. If you haven't looked at the chat, we've posted 3 things in the chat for you. We posted a summary of this project where you can nicely download the link to the full manuscript if you want to read it in detail, along with the supplementary tables and contact information for Elizabeth, which would allow you to follow up individually afterwards. So Elizabeth, if you could share a little bit more about the module. Gary.
Sorry about that. I tried to mute myself and then couldn't find it. So thank you, Mark. I do want to expand a little bit on what Mark started saying. So as he mentioned, we launched a module for PROBE on International Women's Day for women with bleeding disorders. And our next goal is to expand PROBE for people with VWD, and we will use the coreVWD, core outcome set, as our guidance to think about what types of questions we need to add. And, do we need to edit some of the current questions on PROBE? Do we need to add into the specific VWD module? So the very first question on PROBE will be, what is your bleeding disorder? And then if you say hemophilia, you'll get the hemophilia questions. If you say VWD, you'll be directed to the VWD questions. But we did do this little mapping exercise that Mark mentioned. So you can see in on the first column, the type, again, that goes with that Venn diagram that we showed. So we had some that overlapped, that were some outcomes that were recommended for all studies. And then of course, prophylaxis, perioperative, those women's health outcomes. And then we did recommend as well for adverse events outcomes. Those for adverse events outcomes are not on our Venn diagram because adverse events always have to be included in clinical trials. So we felt okay to leave them off, but for our mapping purposes, they are here. And you can see some of the outcomes are captured by some of the PROBE's questions. And those are the ones such as bleeds requiring treatment, because we ask about treatment product and treatment regimen on probe. Frequency of bleeds, we do ask about bleeds in the last year and the last 2 weeks on probe. And then you can see the purple boxes are the ones where we feel that we have added a new question in that women's health study that captures this. And so these questions can also be used for the von Willebrand disease model. But you can see the ones with the thick black outline are the ones that we definitely want to focus on adding new questions, making sure we're asking about the right things, with the goal to be that we expand the probe study in order to capture as many of these core outcomes as possible. Doing so, we'll be able to promote the core outcome set. We've come up with this core outcome set, but the next important step is we need those outcomes to actually be measured in the clinical trials. So we're recommending outcomes, and now we want to say, yes, these are what's recommended to be measured, and here's one way you can do it by using the probe study. All of these things are captured. So that is our goal. And I'm quickly going to show you our plan. We would in order to add this module, this is a figure from the FDA guidance on developing patient-reported outcomes. You don't need to read all the small text. I just want to make it point out a few things here. So we would develop a conceptual framework, and we've already started doing that with coreVWD, because we know which outcomes are the most important. So we know what concepts are the most important related to quality of life for people with VWD. So for that part, we would do focus groups and individual interviews with people living with VWD. We would then go on to add new questions, and then we would test those new questions. And then we would have the new updated probe, the module for VWD, be included in some new studies where we would be able to see how well those questions perform, whether or not we need to make any changes. And then, we can go on to this last thing here, number 5, which would be to modify the instrument. So that is our overall plan. After that's done, we would do our next steps, which anytime we update the probe study, which would be to program it on our e-platform for online administration, translate into key languages, and then go on to do additional studies to make sure that those questions that we added in that the women's module and the VWD module are both reliable and valid for content validation and further construct validation. And then we would take any feedback as people use the instrument. This would also allow us to, we work with the World Bleeding Disorder Registry. Currently, Probe is part of that patient app. So our goal would be to add the women's module and the VWD module to that as well, so they can collect data, the probe questions there. And then we have some ideas for other potential core VWD follow-up work. We don't want this to be just an exercise that we do and we never talk about it again. We want to keep using this to advocate to allow people to get better access to treatment, to be measuring the right things, collecting the right things. So we have some ideas about other potential follow-up work. And then I do have my contact information here in case you would like to contact me if you have any questions about the work, about follow-up work, or about our publications. So I am going to stop sharing now, and we will start our question and answer session. I do want to acknowledge our Delphi panel, our advisory board and project team, project support from the patient organizations that Paula talked about, and also our sponsors once again. So thank you very much. And I will stop sharing now.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth and Mark and Biba and Nicole and Dr. James, for explaining this important initiative, how it was undertaken, and why it is important to the medical and the lived experience community. Just before we start the live Q&A, I will just reiterate what Mark said. Have a look at the bottom of your screen. You should see a chat icon, and in that chat icon, you will see a couple of things I've dropped in there. There's the full paper, the link to the full paper reporting the core VWD outcomes. There is a PDF of a one-page overview. Now, I'm not sure if anyone is able to download that. Someone's popped me a message here saying that they weren't able to. So what maybe we can do is send it to people after the webinar. I think with your registration, if your email is with your registration, I should be able to see that and send that out to you. If anybody has been able to download it, please pop a yes somewhere into the Q&A box maybe, and let us know whether that's working or not. I've also put the contact information for Elizabeth into the chat. So if you want to reach out to the Patient Outcomes Research Group and follow up with them, you can email her. And for those of you who are on the LinkedIn Live event, I've put those links into those comments as well. So grab those, save them somewhere for later. And now we will go ahead with our Q&A. If you have any questions for Dr. James, Baiba, Nicole, Elizabeth, or Mark, please enter them in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, pretty close to your chat feature probably, and we'll do our best to answer all of them. So maybe we can start with a question that's maybe a little bit broad, but my understanding of VWD over the last few years has evolved. And I know Dr. James and Baiba both highlighted this, that people's experiences of VWD are very varied. It seems to be something that's really very different for different people. So how then are you able to come together with a set of outcomes that is the set of outcomes for VWD when there's such a diversity?
The answer first. That's why there's so many. I think for some hemophilia clinical trials, for example, annualized bleed rate, which really is counting musculoskeletal bleeds, joint bleeds, that one outcome worked reasonably well for most patients. And so I think we knew this from the beginning, that this was going to be more complicated, that our outcome set was going to have to be broader to reflect the different kinds of bleeding symptoms that patients experience, and also that they experience different symptoms at different parts of their life. One patient's bleeding isn't the same, and it's not static over time. So I think it's the breadth of it, Fiona, that speaks to your question about how is it that we're trying to encompass all of these different experiences.
Great, thank you. Did anybody else want to mention anything there? Maybe I can actually take this then to Baiba and to Nicole. Baiba, you mentioned that all outcomes are important to people with VWD. And I know this was a really hard thing to do, but I want to ask you about it. Like, how did you manage to rank and vote for the relative importance when everything's important to people with VWD?
I think we had the success because Elizabeth and her team had already filtered out like everything from the research, all the published data. So it was very easy. We just were ranking, and of course everything seemed very important for us, for people who never got the attention to the level that we had in this project. So I think we tried to do the best we could. We were explaining why one thing is more important than the other one, and probably that's why we have the outcome set as it is. So yeah.
I think one of the nice things I was going to say, one of the nice things I would add is, health equity is an important topic, not just for those living within a disease, but even between diseases. And I think for too long, we have just used hemophilia bleeding outcomes as a proxy for von Willebrand disease. And so we look at legacy outcomes such as, the number of bleeding events, and we think of target joints in hemophilia. And as this core outcome set's demonstrated, the way bleeding manifests in von Willebrand disease is significantly different. Although men equally have von Willebrand disease like women, it really is important that we bring these other topics forward. So I think it's really a new day and a new opportunity, and hopefully over time the data will build. This isn't just important for new treatments, which we hope that the innovative treatments that are coming will utilize this, but also for legacy treatments and just for the general management of care. When those living with von Willebrand disease, even look at these questions and complete them, it may become a conversation starter for their clinical visits, as well as certainly a strong advocacy tool to allow VWD to catch up and achieve health equity and parity with the way those living with hemophilia are managed.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Nicole, did you want to add something?
Yeah, back to your, the how did I manage to rank everything? Multiple rounds, lots of pausing, lots of emails to Elizabeth. I'm like, hold on, wait a minute. But in real seriousness, I think that I thought a lot about my community. And so because I'm in this dual role, I have the pleasure and honor of meeting so many women and actually boys, men, everybody across the country with VWD. I hear their stories. And then I kind of like took together a lot of those common themes, and I tried to keep their stories and their voices in my head as I was making choices, because I didn't want to just make choices for Nicole. I know what would be helpful for Nicole, but that's not what this is about. This is about the greater community. And so, you know, I always say, like, let's not forget about the boys. I don't remember if I said that in one of these meetings, but we can't. Yes, there's so much for the girls, and we do need to make sure that's important, but we can't forget about our boys too. And so I feel like that's something I also felt was important and highlighted. But yeah, I just tried to keep those experiences kind of at the forefront of my head, including my own. And that was very helpful in my decision making, to know what's really happening out there, right? That's how I had that like insider view, however you'd like to call that.
Well, that really is the lived experience expertise, right? That is the expertise that you have that no one else has, and I think that's really what this initiative does. It harnesses that, and but it is a big responsibility, and it's a lot of work on your part to keep everybody in mind and to represent everybody by that. So
I would agree. And it was very exciting to see people like Biba on this committee and others that I didn't, because I had no say in whoever got chosen. So when I saw these really amazing people who I know are strong advocates, I was like, oh, they got it right. Yes. So nice.
You raise a really important point. And I think maybe, I don't know if Mark or Elizabeth, you want to speak to this, but why is it important to have lived experience experts, patients involved in this, not only in terms of getting it right, but also in terms of people's perception of what's coming out, of how decisions are being made? What does it do to the trust that you hope people can put in your output?
I would comment that, I think it's important that individuals see themselves in the results. And I think what we're hearing from Vibe and Nicole is they see their lives in these results. And if these outcomes could be impacted, they're telling you that this would make a difference in their life. I think one of the important things in the US is the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, launched almost a decade ago the Patient-Focused Drug Development Initiative. And as part of that, the FDA clearly articulated the reason for doing this is patients think differently than regulators, industry, payers. And we want the same thing in the end. We want an improved quality of life. We want reductions in bleedings, but how we think and how we speak may be very different. And so this, again, becomes a tool to bridge that conversation, to harmonize the conversation so that we really are all moving forward together. So
maybe I can just share with you some of the feedback we've got from one of our audience members, was just saying, thank you so much. The knowledge is power. I'm somebody who's facing a lot of challenges, not being diagnosed until 3 months ago. And now really, I think, inspired and empowered by what you're doing. So a big thank you from them to you for this work. And thank you to Tara for reaching out with that. You mentioned regulators, Mark. I think there were some regulators involved in your voting panel. Can you say anything about the perspective they had, that they brought, and whether you think being involved in this might have done anything to the perspective that they took away?
I think clearly, yes. At least, so we did this exercise with hemophilia a number of years ago, and clearly it's helped shape and influence the way they've thought about new hemophilia therapies and gene therapy for hemophilia. And so it was with that confidence and experience in our prior work that they readily agreed to join us, and not just from the U.S. side, but from other countries as well. And so it will take some work to educate deeper into the bowels and to the people that are of the FDA. But we have the same expectation that this really will inform those that are reviewing drug applications, that are thinking about safety and efficacy, as they think about protocols that come in and what the primary and secondary or exploratory endpoints are that drug developers are using, that hopefully they'll have this on their mind and they'll say, how are you capturing the patient voice in this? Is it just a number to get your license from the FDA to market the drug, or are you able to demonstrate that this really makes a difference? And we've seen that transformation over the past few years because of the Patient-Focused Drug Initiative. So we think we're very much supporting the direction that they want to go. And this will be a key piece of that for VWD in particular in this instance.
Yeah, so thinking about the next steps for this work, I mean, you talked a bit, Elizabeth, about the plan to create the module, but how do you connect to the people who are designing trials and advocate to them to use the module and to incorporate these outcomes into their trials? Is it just a hope that, knowing the regulators value this, they're going to maybe value it as well? Or do you have any ways to sort of advocate directly to them, or how does that work?
So that's a very good question. And that's where we will continue to have to work here. Part of the reason one of the things that makes our partnership with the patient organization so great is that they can help us. They're constantly talking with the pharma companies and and regulators and saying what's important. And the more we talk about it, the more the core outcome set is publicized, the more it's used. And it's almost in a way, if we can, and we believe, we can get these companies that sponsor this work on board, they now see what's the most important. So, they've said to us, they see what's most important. They're going to try to include these things. They've heard from the people, our voters, our patients that were voters, why things are important. And so they will try to include them in their trials as best as possible. And sometimes they come to a point where they say, well, we do want to include this outcome, but we don't know how. So that becomes future work that we need to do. And part of it, our answer may be, well, we have now developed this module and this will cover, is it going to cover all of the core outcomes? Maybe, maybe not. But if it covers 80 or 90% of the core outcomes, then they can measure probe and then they can add on their other outcomes. Now, of course, they have outcomes. And the thing with developing a clinical trial is they will include outcomes for efficacy and safety, as Mark mentioned. So probe can be included as an exploratory outcome, or it can be included in addition to some of those clinical measures to capture that PRO side. So it's just a lot of advocating for using the core outcome set, getting people to talk about it. And, if you have 5 companies that are running a trial on a new treatment for von Willebrand disease and they're using the core outcome set, that next company is also, the goal is that they will also want to measure those same things so that so that their treatment can be compared to those other treatments.
If I could just make one additional comment. So all of the sponsors that were mentioned for this project, and some of which were on the slide that Dr. James presented about therapies in development, all had the opportunity to have a briefing for their company on the work. So hopefully it's factored into their programs. We're looking at opportunities for podium presentations, for posters and abstracts. We have one coming up at the ISTH meeting in about 2 weeks' time, the International Society of Thrombosis Hemostasis here. But if there is an opportunity that we've missed where you would like a speaker, a presentation, you can think of some way that we can get the word out. We are more than happy to see if we can arrange for a member of our team to do that for you, or to make the materials available, including the sort of the one-page summary that's in the chat. So just please reach out with your ideas of an audience we might be missing. Oh, and there he is.
The puppy. Maybe I can just ask one last quick question, and maybe I'll direct this to Dr. James. This is coming from Tara, again, from our audience. Is it possible to use some of these materials, like maybe this one page or maybe this paper, to advocate even within, the treatment community? So, for example, Tara's talking about advocating to the OBGYN community because it has been missed for decades in her family. Are these materials even potentially things that you can take to your healthcare providers and use in advocacy and in conversations with them?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think what it tells the healthcare provider is they need to be informed about how treatments impact these outcomes to appropriately have a conversation with a patient about what the right treatment is. So I think it gives some framework for that conversation. So I absolutely support using it in that way.
Super. Thank you very much. Well, that brings us to the end of our Q&A. I really want to thank Dr. James, Baiba, Nicole, Mark, and Elizabeth for sharing your time and your expertise with us this afternoon. And also a big thank you to everybody who's joined us today. Thank you for being there. This recorded webinar will be available shortly on bleeding.org under the Events tab. If you select past events, you can find all of our archived webinars there. This is also where you can see our upcoming webinars. We're going to take a little break for a few weeks, and we will be back on July 16th for the second installment of the NBDF HTRS Research Journal Club. And Drs. Shannon Carpenter and Lauren Amos will tell us all about research with children and bleeding disorders. Thank you so much for joining us today. Have an excellent week.